We're going to have on Anthony Mingioni. He's the Flyers beat reporter for Center Ice Philly magazine. And Anthony and I are going to spend a few minutes here trying to figure out the opening lineup of the opening night lineup and who's going to be on what line, and basically talk a little bit about some of the changes the Flyers have made. Are they good or bad? So, Anthony, good morning to you. How are you, sir?
Doing well, Pete.
I mean, if it's Flyers hockey, first and foremost, the goaltending situation. Everybody knows Carter Hart, but were you surprised at who the backup's going to be?
Not really. There have been thought that, you know, when they had acquired Cam Talbot late in the season, that there was some thought that there was a bit of an audition to see who was going to end up being Carter Hart's backup. And we didn't see much of Talbot, but we saw a lot of Brian Elliott down the stretch, which probably ended up being a fairly telling sign. And the longer kind of things went where we didn't hear anything with regards to Talbot, there was definitely a thought of there might be an NHL starting job out there. And as it turns out, Talbot ends up in Calgary, likely as the 1 and 1A with David Rittich in Calgary. So that certainly opened the door for, with the amount of games that he played down the stretch, that Brian Elliott was likely going to be getting tabbed as the Flyers' backup goaltender, considering there were some options in the off. There were a few other options, potentially maybe a Curtis McElhinney, but he's about 37 years old. So there was a few other options potentially, but the path of least resistance was likely bringing Elliott back, and certainly on a much more palatable $2 million one-year contract. He knows what his role will be, making sure to obviously to back up Hart.
So 1 year, $2 million for Elliott, but of course Carter Hart's the future. At least that's what the fan base thinks. That's what the front office thinks. That's, I believe, what the previous coach thought. I think that's probably what the current coach thinks. In the sample size of what you got to see from Carter Hart, what makes you, or what's your opinion of Carter Hart and where he can go?
Pretty impressed with how quickly he was able to transition, especially at a young age, because for the most part, young goaltending, you don't often see goaltending prospects playing in the NHL at age 20. You have to have a really, really good head on your shoulders. And even from the drop, even at age 17, when he came to his first developmental camp with the Flyers, you could tell there was something different about Hart in terms of how he carried himself, how he spoke. There was a certain, you felt like you were speaking to someone who was at least, 7, 8 years or older, with a real understanding of himself and where, what he wants and how, of course, he was going to sort of mentally structure things. But still, going into last season, the thought was you're going to at least have about a year of Hart being, obviously playing with the Lehigh Valley Phantoms as he got his feet wet at the pro level. And then obviously circumstances hit with the Flyers putting up an NHL record number of goaltenders with the amount of injuries they had, obviously with Brian Elliott, with obviously Michael Neuwirth. Alex Lyon was out obviously at the start of the season for 4 weeks. That really made things difficult for the Flyers, where they were kind of getting by on spit and bailing wire, picking up goalies like Cal Pickard off of waivers. It was just, and circumstances were what they were. He got in earlier than expected, and he basically took the ball and ran with it, and did a really, really, really impressive job at age 20 to be able to kind of do what he was able to do during the season. And really, before his injury, there was enough whispers about him being in Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year candidacy. Maybe not to win the trophy, but to potentially be a nominee. And in the end, I would say for the most part, Hart had a really good first season as an NHL goaltender. Now it's going to be year two. You have the old phrase, heavy is the head that wears the crown. Now he knows he's the starter. How does that sort of play as he goes into his second year? And the team in front of him, I think, will obviously have a big thing to do with that.
Anthony Mingioni is with us, Flyers beat reporter from Center Ice Philly magazine, and we're talking Flyers, and you build from the goaltender out, so then the defenseman would be the next position as we look at the roster and sort of break it through. You'd kind of think, I guess, at this point, the top six on that depth chart seems fairly clear, but there's some question marks as to who's going to be the defenseman when the puck drops on October 4th in, by the way, the Czech Republic.
Exactly. And the key also is the fact that one of the Flyers' most important defensemen, one of their key defensemen, Ivan Provorov, is still obviously without a contract. And it's certainly a situation where he's amongst a group of RFAs in the NHL that are really kind of in a holding pattern right now. Everybody's kind of waiting to see what happens with contracts here. If the Flyers are going to go the Flyers would want to go long-term, obviously, I think, with Hart, but there's a chance, obviously, not with Hart, with Provorov, but there's also, I think, a really good chance here that we may be looking at a bridge deal if they can't come to sort of a good idea on a long-term contract. Now, the Flyers already signed Travis Sanheim to a 3-year bridge agreement, so there is that consideration of cap consideration going forward. The Flyers basically right now have 7 defensemen, not counting Provorov. Once they have Provorov in the mix, they're going to actually be at 8 technically on roster, and they're going to have to make a decision on that. The way they kind of structure things, especially free agency-wise, they went out there and not necessarily just a free agency, but a defensive acquisition. One of the Flyers' biggest problems last year, for as much as we talk about goal scoring, is that the Flyers really need to cut down on their goals against average majorly. So the Flyers obviously went out and got a pair of veteran defensemen in Matt Niskanen, trading Radko Gudas to Washington for Niskanen, who's known to be, even though he had an off year last year, was a defenseman that logged over 25 minutes a game in the playoffs for the Stanley Cup champion Capitals a couple of years ago. And then, of course, they brought in Justin Braun from the San Jose Sharks, who I believe will add a little bit of the physicality that they lost in Gudas, but I think will add a bit more defensively responsible play. And he also was a guy who used to be able to get decent number of points as well. The Flyers are kind of banking on both of those veterans having bounce-back years and helping to augment the development of Provorov when he signs, and Travis Sanheim, along with obviously Shane Gostisbehere. You have Robert Haig in the mix. You have, of course, Sam Morin kind of in the deep mix there in that circumstance as well. So the Flyers are running anywhere between 7 to 8 defensemen once Provorov come back. So that's the decisions they're going to have to make with regards to how they're going to structure things.
Yeah, that's definitely why I wanted to ask you that, Anthony, because, you could kind of look at 7 and then Provorov definitely the question mark. But let me follow up by asking you this. Of the 2 guys that they brought in, Justin Braun and Matt Niskanen, who do you think will have the most immediate impact on the Flyers' blue lining core?
I think in many ways Niskanen, because I think of the responsibilities that Niskanen's going to have. I think they brought him in. He was known to be a pretty decent point producer for the Capitals from the back end. The key thing is that the Flyers have to be most concerned. The biggest concern that they've had is obviously gap control between the forwards and the defense. And there were times they were kept on trying to find an appropriate partner for Provorov in this case. Now, they used to have him paired at times with Shane Gostisbehere, but Gostisbehere is obviously known to freelance, obviously, to move into the offensive zone, and they would leave openings there. Whereas, again, Provorov has a lot of offensive capability, but I think he needs a partner who's willing to maintain gaps, watch his back when he actually wants to go pinch in and make a play, but also he's really, really, known to be a cerebral, intelligent defenseman. To a man, most Washington Capitals will say he's the one guy that when you're in a foxhole, quote unquote, this is the guy who's probably one of the most dependable guys they had on their blue line. Again, he had an off year last year. I think he was a bit, it was a really deep, long playoff run by Niskanen's by Niskanen's own admittance. He also took a hard hit mid-season. I think there may have been a bit of concussion-related issues, and he did pass protocol. But I do think Niskanen is important. But I certainly wouldn't count out on Braun either. I think Braun provides a necessary, defensive defenseman element. Not necessarily stay at home, but a guy that I think for let's say a defenseman like Travis Sanheim can really kind of help him as well. Of the 2, if you're asking me to put, sort of in this circumstance, flip a coin, I'd probably edge it closer to Niskanen, but I think Braun does have an effect too.
We're spending some time with Anthony Mingioni. He's a Flyers beat reporter for Center Ice Philly Magazine. Find him at Anthony Mingioni. That's ANTHONY-MINGIONI on Twitter. A must follow if you're following Flyers hockey and you want to get the truth. Not just the fandom. You need the truth from an independent judge, if you will. Anthony, let's move on to the forwards here. And obviously, and my producer Hunter and I were talking about this off the air this morning. Hunter, by the way, full disclosure, played the game. I played, but, not much past like 16. So, I mean, it's been a long time since I've laced him up. But Hunter played the game. And one of the things that jumped to his mind, he says, hey, when you get Anthony on, make sure you bring up Kevin Hayes and the amount of money they gave him. I mean, that's a lot of money as we get to the forward position.
It is. It was certainly a bit, we knew that there was going to be, that the contract, the longer it went, especially after they made the trade with Winnipeg to basically jump the market on Hayes, the idea was that the contract was certainly going to be likely in the 6 to 7 year range, and then certainly that's how it played out. I think certainly people were expecting maybe in the the $6 million range potentially, but when the contract was announced at 7.14, the initial reaction for a center who had basically topped out last year over 20 goals and 50 points. Well, that now has to be based on that salary. That has to be the standard now, pretty much each season. That's the expectation. Now, again, the one thing that Hayes does provide, I think, more than let's say a Matt Duchene does, it was probably the other major offense centerman on the market, is the fact that I think Hayes is overall a better overall two-way player. And at age 27, I think you're getting him at the prime years of his career. You add to the mix, I think, as well, the fact that he has obviously experience playing in Alain Vigneault's system. Is going through. He went through tough love in the early part of his career with Vigneault, and now Vigneault very much trusts him as a forward. The Flyers, really, I think, because of this two-way play, that added to the overall how much money it was going to they were going to need in order to do. And again, he had the advantage of being an unrestricted free agent, so he knew there was likely going to be a real market, obviously, out there for his services. I think he probably would have received that number, or potentially more than that on the open market, the way contracts were thrown out this year. And considering his age, his price, where his age is at, and you're getting him at the prime point of his career, you add to the fact that, Philadelphia desperately needed a second-line center because of the fact that Nolan Patrick had a very inconsistent season. He'd have stretches where he really looked good, and there would be a lot of stretches where he was extremely inconsistent. The one thing, again, that I think Hayes does provide is, I think, a level of dependability two-way. He does have experience playing off on the wing as well. He started his career in the NHL playing on the wing, and now he's a center. So there's a versatility that happens that if, in the event that Patrick really kind of takes off, you could easily swing Hayes off to the wing, so that added versatility does add to the price tag. But again, the expectation is now that at his price point for the next 7 seasons, anything less than in the mid 20 goal range, and anything less than the mid 50 point range for the salary that he's receiving, that's gonna garner some criticism. So that's what he's basically shouldering here as he comes in.
We're talking a little Flyers hockey here on the Pete Thompson Show on 97.3 ESPN, talking about Kevin Hayes and the money they gave him, second-line center. So, yeah, that knocks down Nolan Patrick probably to the third line, Couturier first line, Hayes second, and then Nolan Patrick could maybe be comfortable on a third line instead of the pressure of 2 or even 1 at times. So, all right, we've gone through some of the forwards, and I'll just obligatory, throw my opinion in real quick that all the idiots out there that are like, oh, you got to get rid of Voracek. You got to get rid of Giroux. Well, Giroux has a no-trade clause, so you can't get rid of him. And Voracek, they owe a boatload of money to, so you're probably not going to get rid of him either. Just suffer with it and hope that they get better this year, Flyers fans. But let's close with this, Anthony, by me asking you about the change behind the bench, because, the Vigneault hire, when I saw it, my initial thought was, okay, but then the numbers that backed it up, historically, Alain Vigneault has been successful at the start of where he goes. What's your take on him behind the bench?
Well, Vigneault does have a reputation. I know a lot of people, being somewhat of a player's coach in this case. I hate to use that sort of acronym, but I also know the fact that he knows how to push buttons, and he also knows he carries with him, obviously a good reputation of being able to, get teams to buy in fairly quickly. It's also known, obviously, one of the biggest things is Philadelphia's special teams, specifically the penalty kill, has been particularly bad, obviously, the last few seasons. If another team goes on the power play, it was almost you were holding your breath if you were a Flyers fan as to what was going to be happening. Vigneault has a reputation of turning around teams 5-on-5 play, but also, more specifically, he puts a particular emphasis on special teams and specifically the penalty kill. That's going to be a big area. That's one of the first areas that I think is going to be important to take note of. And that's another area where, in many ways, the acquisitions of Hayes, Niskanen, and Braun play the biggest role here, especially with Hayes. So Hayes has extensive experience playing on the penalty kill. He's strong, particularly in that department. Also, Braun as well, I believe, in San Jose had obviously experience as well. So many of those moves were structured with the idea of being able to conduct a fairly quick turnaround. The Flyers cut down on the goals against on the power play. I think that can really help to kind of close the gap here in the Metropolitan Division, and not handicap their efforts in terms of trying to make the postseason and make a real run. So between that, the fact that they also brought in two former head coaches as assistant coaches is as much of an interesting thing to watch as it is with Vigneault. Having Michel Therrien on board, who has a defensive reputation, but is going to be handling the forward. So the Flyers basically are telling you, especially Vigneault, that as much as we want to malign the Flyers' defense at times, defense is a whole team concept, and there's a lot of times where the forward specifically were as much of responsible for making mistakes defensively as anything. Specifically, as much as Travis Konechny, who's also an RFA, is a wonderful offensive player. There are times if you're watching him on the ice, you're wondering, what's he thinking on certain plays when the puck goes back the other way defensively. I can guarantee you Therrien is going to be applying a lot of tough love, along with Vigneault as well, to younger players like Konechny to get back on the play much more tightly than they've done in the first few years of their career. You have Mike Yeo handling, obviously, the defense as well. So it's going to be really fascinating to see how, Vigneault is able to sort of get this team, on board with what he's doing. How, Hayes may play a role in being kind of the Vigneault whisperer in certain circumstances for the forwards because he's played under him. And it's going to be really fascinating to watch this season, Pete.